So on the top of Daf Yud and Aleph, we were learning about various kinds of crawling creatures and rodents and so forth and so on. And if they get into liquids, maybe because there was a flask that was uncovered, they don't usually cover the liquids, but in any event, there was a whole issue about tuma, and this leads the Gemara to the issue of what's called mayim megulim. So we'll start with Tanan Hossam, which is approximately seven lines down from the top of the Amud on Daf Yud. And this is a study of a Mishnah in Trumos about Gimel Mashkim, three kinds of liquids. Now we have to put ourselves sort of back into a different time frame when snakes were all over the place. I guess in certain places even today there are snakes, and there are three kinds of liquids that the danger, if they're exposed over a certain period of time, that maybe the snakes left a venom, something very toxic and dangerous inside the liquids, and therefore not allowed to drink them. And that's mayim v'yayim v'cholov. So these are the three liquids that are classified as mayim megulim. And then the question is, Kama Yishu V'yu Asurim, how long did they stay uncovered, and therefore you didn't supervise them, and they become Asur Midim Mayim Megulim, Kidei Sheyetze Harachash Mimakom Karav V'yishte. So Rachash is a kind of a reptile that's very poisonous, and as long as it takes for the reptile to get out of some sort of close by place and drink from this water or milk or wine, that's if that period passes by. But then the Gemara asks, well, Kama Mokov Karov. Well, you say a nearby place. I mean, where are these reptiles coming from? How close are they? Amar Rabbi Yisrael Rabbi Yehuda, Kidei Sheyetze Mitachas Ozen Kli V'yishte. So there was a handle in the kli that was used to pick up the kli, and underneath the handle there was a hole in the kli, and the reptile used to somehow get into that hole, and then when the time came, he would come out of the hole and leave his venom inside the drink, whatever that drink was, one of these three drinks. So basically, when it says Kadesh Yetze Rachash Makom Karov, it's very, very close. So you need almost constant surveillance or supervision to guarantee that the reptile didn't. This was a very dangerous situation in those times. And the Gemara says, Yishta, what does it mean when you say that the reptile's coming from a close place and drinks from the drink? Hakachazile. I mean, if you're describing a situation where the reptile was drinking and you know he's drinking, then you must have seen him drinking. And if you see him drinking, then what's the chiddush of Mayim Megulim? You know that there's a very serious uh, percentage of a high, let's call it a high probability that there's venom in the drink because you saw him drinking. So, you know, he oozes out some of his poisonous venom. But rather, it doesn't mean that it's the amount of time that it took for him to drink, meaning that you saw him drinking, but rather it means that he drank and he went back into the hole and you never saw him. So it's not that you saw him drink, but there was enough time for him to come out of the hole, drink from the vessel, and then go back into the hole. Now, it's not clear exactly how long of a time period that is. It would seem it's a very short time period. I don't know. I looked here and I didn't see exactly, if they defined it. Maybe because it's not so relevant in our time. I don't know. Anyway, now we go back to the sugya on Daf Tes of Rav Huna. And Rav Huna had made a statement that since the animal in its lifetime has a chazaka of Isur, which is called Behema B'chayeh B'cheskas Isur Omedes, because of the Isur of Evrim Nachai. Therefore, says Rav Huna, in order for the shechita to be matir the chazaka, you've got to be absolutely certain that the shechita was a proper shechita. Itmar. So that was Rav Huna. We're going to have Rav Huna again here. Now, this is a very, very profound sugya because if you find out that the sakin that you use for the shechita was nicked and therefore was possible shechita, but you only found out after the shechita, and therefore you're in doubt as to whether or not this nick took place after the shechita, or it was there already before the shechita. So Rav Huna is machmir, and Omer Rav Huna afilu. Oh, so now obviously, if you find a nick in the knife, you have to assume that when you shechted it was already a sakin puguma, unless you could be tole. Now, what is the concept of tliya? Tliya means, like for example, in Masechta Nida, there's a very famous sugya of tliya, uh, where a woman was working with, let's say cutting up a chicken or whatever it might be that had dam, and then she finds dam on her beged that she could be told that it came from the outside because she has a cheskes tara. And here too, if there's a tliya, then we could begin to understand what Rav Huna's chumrah is all about. And he's going to say that just disregard the tliya. Now, what was the tliya? That's what's called here, afilu shiber ba'atzamos kol hayom. After he shechted the animal, he used the same knife to cut up bones. And we can now have an easy tliya. We're going to say that at the time that he shechted, there were no nicks in the sakin, and it was not a sakin paguma, but rather became a sakin paguma as a result of the fact that he was chopping up bones. And nevertheless, Rav Huna is going to say psula chayshin and shema ba'ar nifgama. We're not going to use the tliya and assume that after the shechita, as a result of his cutting up the bones, the knife became paguma. But rather, we're going to assume that when he shechted the animal, and the shechita knife has to go through the neck, but before it gets to the neck, there's skin, there's hide, and maybe it had a nick when he got to the simanim because it was already nicked through the animal's neck. But Rav Chisda Makshera, Rav Chisda says Shema be'etzem nifkuma. The word Shema here is a little misleading. Shema means it's probable that and we could be told that it became pogum after the shechita when he was cutting up the bones. And basically, Rav Chisda is relying on a chazaka that we have every reason to believe that the knife was kshera at the time of the shechita, and now we could be told that any pagam in the knife happened after the shechita. But Rav Huna's machmir, he doesn't want to be told. Now, the Gemara says that this psak of Rav Huna is simply an application of Rav Huna's principle that once the animal is established in its lifetime as having a cheskes iser. You cannot remove that cheskes iser unless you're absolutely certain that the shechita was a good shechita. Here we can't be absolutely certain because there is a possibility that the knife became puguma before he got to the simonim when it hit the neck of the animal, the hide of the neck of the animal. So that's what the Gemara says now. Bishleim Rav Huna b'shmaita. Rav Huna is being very consistent. He's really just reflecting his shita that we don't have vados here to remove and undermine the cheskes iser. But El Rav Chisda my taima, what pushes Rav Chisda to assume that the pagima was a result of the chopping up of the bones? Maybe it developed at the beginning of the shechita before he got to the simonim. And now we get to another principle in halacha, which is very, very common throughout Shas, called ein safek motz midei vadai, namely, etzem vadai pogem. If you cut up bones, it's going to create, cracks and nicks in the knife. That's almost definite. But as far as the hide that the skin around the neck of the animal, well, safek pogem, safek ena pogem. There's no how should I say netia? There's no inclination to assume that would be pogem the knife. Otherwise, every shechita would be assumed to be possible. So that becomes a safek. So we have the vadai pegima through the atzamos, the bones, and a safek pegima through the or, and ein safek motzu b'dei vadai. So the pegima through the chopping up of the bones sets up a vadai. Again, a knife might have gotten nicked twice. Once through the hide, and again through the chopping of the bones. But we're looking at the knife, and we want to know what caused the knife to be pogum. And we're going to say that the vadai is what caused the big pogum. And now you want to say, no, maybe there's the safek caused it to ain't safek motzu de vadai. Like, for example, the Gemara says in Psachim that if you know that there was, the Gemara talks about, it's pretty gory over there, a dead fetus, that it was in the ohel, that's matame, and you have a safek, maybe the weasel came and removed it from the bias, and you went into the bias. So once again, we're going to say ain't safek motzu b'dei vadai. Or let's say, for example, that you took out the chametz and you did a bedika, and now you see, some sort of animal that's crawling back into the house after you did the bedika. Maybe that animal is carrying chametz and bringing it back into the house. Ain't safek motzu b'dei vadai. Masiv Rava l'siyul Rav Huna. Rav Huna is going to be supported now by a brisa quoted by Rava. What does the brisa say? Taval v'ola v'nimtzal davar achotzitz. Once again, we have a cheskes iser because before he jumped into the mikveh, he was tamei vadai. Now the mikveh is there to take him out of the chazaka and generate an assumption that he was tahar. But the only problem is we find that there's something of a chatzitza that's on his body. And we don't know whether that davar chatzitz came onto his body before he jumped into the mikveh or only after he got out of the mikveh. If afal pishin is asik boso min kol hayom kulo, even though we have a reason to be tola it, because after he came out of the mikveh, he was busy handling all sorts of types of things that could have gotten stuck to his body and created the chatzitza. So you and I would say, well, the tefillah itself, the immersion into the mikveh, creates a new chazaka of tahara, and now anything that happens later to undermine that chazaka by generating a suffix, maybe there was a chatzitza at the time of the tvila, we're going to be tola it in order to support the chazaka of Tara. But no, the Brisa says lo also lo tefillah. Why? Because we have now a question about the tefillah. We have a vadai tome that creates a chazaka, and now we have to remove that chazaka ad shiyomer bari li shelo yola kodolche, until he can be absolutely certain. I know there was no chatzitza when I went into the mikveh. Now, let's try to analyze this from the perspective of Rav Chizda, who applies the principle of ein safek motzim midei vada. We have now a vadai that there was a davar achotzitz that came on because he was osek. What's the language of the Gemara? Osek be oso min. In other words, that which is on his body, which generates the suffix of chatzitza, is exactly the same identical substance that he was working with after he came out of the mikveh for the whole day. So that creates a vadai. Now you have a suffix that says that maybe he had a chatzitza at the time that he went into the mikveh. We should have applied the principle of ein suffix motzim midei vadai. Not only that, we have a cheskas tara through the tefillah, suffix havi Allah, and now we have a suffix. Well, maybe, perhaps, lest he had a chatzitza when he went into the mikveh, suffix lo havi Allah. Because he's suffering about tefillah. Why does the fact that now he has a davar chotzis on his body subsequent to the tefillah? Why does that give me a right to undermine the tefillah itself? The tefillah creates a vadai. And included in the Gemara's question, apparently, is the fact that we have a perfectly reliable tliya over here. The Gemara answers, Shani Hosam to equal a meimar hame tame al cheskasa the emelo tava. Now the Gemara is applying a logic that l'chora makes no sense in order to defend Rav Chizda, because all of Rav Huna's chumrah was based on the original chazaka that the animal had bechayeha, that it is aver menachayim becheskas iser, and you can't remove that cheskas iser until you have a vadai. The same thing should be true with regard to the cheskas tuma. Before he jumped into the mikveh, he was a vadai tame, and now you have to prove that the tefillah was a definitely good tefillah in order to remove the cheskas iser. It's hachinami, and if we apply this logic, which Rav Chizda has to adopt based on the Bryce of Rav, in the case of a chatzitza, then why don't we apply it? This is the kash on Rav Chizda. Hachinami, we should apply it behami behema cheskos lo nishchto. We should say that the behema retains its cheskas isur until you know for sure that there was a shchita kshera. So the Gemara answers, you know what Rav Chizda is based on? Harei shachut lefanecha. Look, there's a shchita. You want to tell me the shchita was invalid because the because the knife had nicks in it? You're now taking out, you're removing the chazaka of the knife. We're not going to allow you to do that. Frekti Gemara, hachinami. Well, why don't you apply the same logic consistently here? Harei tavel lefanecha. There's a tefillah. Now you want to say there was a chatzitza to remove the tefillah. So Gemara says, well, now we see that he has a chatzitza on his body, so we can't rely on the tefillah. So the Gemara says, now you see that there's a nick on the knife. I mean, the Gemara is going back and forth. Every time the Gemara gives an answer, the Gemara says, well, why is it different than shchita? And now the Gemara comes to the final conclusion, and this is going to be the accepted, we call it in Yiddish, the Unterste Shura, the bottom line as far as Rav Chizda, and we have to rack our brains to figure this out. The Gemara says, Sakin Isroi, Behema Lo Isroi. What are we judging here? when we have a doubt as to whether or not the knife had nicks on it at the
Mhm.
time of the shechita, and Rav Chisda says we don't assume so, what is the object that we are judging here? So you and I would have said we're judging the knife. The
Yeah.
knife has a razor because now I look at the knife after the shechita and it's got nicks on it. Nain, says Rav Chisda, that's not what we're judging. In modern Hebrew, we say nidon. Nidon means what are we judging? The nidon is not the knife, but the animal. The animal now is geschachted. You can take a look at the two simanim if you have any doubts. They're completely sliced. So therefore, shachet lefanecha. We're going to look at the animal. We're going to say this animal doesn't have a cheskes isur. It's already been slaughtered. The issue on the knife becomes an external issue, and any reusa that you have on the knife is completely neutralized by the status of the animal. The animal is slaughtered. Now, the big question here is why doesn't the Gemara throw it back in the face of Rav Chisda and apply the same logic to the case of Tefillah? But the answer is very fundamental, very pashut. In the case of Tefillah, the issue of Chatzitza is on the Gavra, it's on the mensch that went into the mikvah. He was Tameh, and now you want to change his status by assuming that he was Tovel. I don't know if he was Tovel, because if there was a Chatzitza on his body, he wasn't Tovel. Mesve. Now again, the Gemara is coming back to attack Rav Chisda with a brisa. The brisa says, "Shocher saveshet." Right, there are two simonim that have to be cut in a case of shchita. There's the veshet and the kone. The veshet is called in English the esophagus. That's where the food
Mhm.
goes down into
Right.
the stomach. So that's one pipe. There's another pipe which is called the kana, otherwise known in English as the trachea. That's for breathing, for air to go in and out. Anyway, he shechted the veshet, v'yakach nishmito hagargeres. The gargeres is a synonymous word for the veshet. Veshet
Right.
gargeres, gargeres veshet. We have to get that down. Now, kshera. What we have to know here is that we're talking about a bird as opposed to an animal. The difference between shechita of an animal and shechita of a bird is very fundamental. In the case of the shechita of an animal, both simanim have to be cut. In the case of the shechita of a bird, you need rov simon echad. You have to cut the majority of one of the two simanim. So now he already shechted the veshet. That's one of the two simanim. Now the gargeres somehow the veshet got somehow detached. Share. Why? Because we assume that the gargeres was there intact at the time of the shechita. But nishmata gargeres, v'achach shacheres veshet, is psula, because then if the veshet was dislocated before the shechita, then it's a treifa. And the shechita of a treifa cannot be mat to the boss. Let's go on. Shochet Saveshet. So far, so good. And then Nimtza Gargeres Shmuta. He looks at the Gargeres, at the trachea, and it's dislocated. When was it dislocated? Before he shechted the esophagus or after? Eini odem kodem shchita nishmita, im liachar shchita nishchita. So l'chora, we should apply the same machlokas of Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, because the bird was bechezkas isur. There was a shchita of the veshet, and now we want to know what happened to the gargeres. Was it dislocated before or after the shchita? Zaya Maisa v'Amru, Kol Safik b'Shchita Apostle. Mamish exactly like Rav Huna. And the Gemara goes even a step further. Why does it say Kol Safik b'Shchita? What's the extra word Kol? Kol is always a ribuy, lasuye mai. Lav lasuye kahai gavna. In other words, not only do we have a puzzle, a shchita, if we have a doubt about the animal and its status as a treifa, meaning was there a hashmotas hagargeres before the shchita, we also will apply the same logic if there's a suffix on the knife and there was no race on the animal, but we find a nick in the knife after the shchita. And once again, we're going to say it's psula, because until you know for sure that the shchita was good, then the animal's bechezkas isa. It's exactly Rav Huna. Lo, Gemara says no. That's not what the word kol comes to include. La suye suffik shah suffik doros. Right, 2 out of the 3 psule shchita are mentioned here in the Gemara, and that's shehia and drisa. Shehia means he delayed between the shchita and the beginning of the shchita and the end of the shchita, right? He got a phone call in the middle. And drisa means when instead of slicing the simonim, he pulled them up, like he pulled them out. And now we don't know if perhaps he passed the shchita. So now, Rav Chizkiah is going to say that in such a case, we have to be machmir, because it's like a suffix in the animal itself. You don't know how the simonim of the animal were cut, but it has nothing to do with the knife. When does Rav Chizkiah say we could be mekil? That's only if nolad suffix basakin. Because the sakin is extraneous to the animal, and we go with the chazak of the animal because shachut lefanecha, we see that there was shchita. But here we don't know that there was shchita. So the suffix is chal on the animal itself, and here Rav Chizda concedes to Rav Huna that we have to be mach.